Chicago's favorite holiday tradition is back at Lincoln Park Zoo and celebrating 30 years. Get your tickets now for Zoo Lights, presented by ComEd and Invesco QQQ, and enjoy fun seasonal activities while strolling through your zoo under 3 million lights this holiday season. Zoo Lights will be back November 15th and run through January 5th. Tickets are just $7 to $10 with select free nights. Get your tickets at lpzoo.org/zoolights and learn more and secure your spot before it sells out. This episode is brought to you by Mubi, a global streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema. Be sure to catch the cult classic The Fall, now streaming exclusively on Mubi, and a spectacular new 4K restoration. Filmed across 24 countries over a period of 4 years, Tarsem Singh's ostentatious epic sees a bedridden stuntman played by a magnetic Lee Pace spin an escapist fantasy for a hospitalized young girl. You can start streaming this film and more for 30 days free at Mubi.com/CityCast.
I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and today, back by popular demand, is another special edition of CityCast where we zoom out for a minute and discuss what the entire country is talking about. You might not know this, but the CityCast show that you're listening to right now is part of a national network of daily local podcasts. CityCast has teams around the country on the ground making newsletters and podcasts that connect people to their cities, including my own hometown of Washington, D.C., huzzah. A few months ago, we tried an experiment. We invited a bunch of our local hosts onto a Zoom call to talk about the stories from their hometowns that you absolutely had to learn about. CityCast listeners loved hearing stories from other cities around the country, and tons of you told us that you wanted us to do this again. So here we are. Like, literally, here are a bunch of hosts again.
Hi, David.
Hey, David.
Yo.
Hi.
Hey, Plotz.
Hello. They're here to tell me the story from their hometown that you absolutely need to hear about this fall. From Utah's crazy plan to seize all the federal land in the state, to the revival of 3 Mile Island. Remember 3 Mile Island, the nuclear power plant? To Austin's ambitious new composting for all plan, and much, much more. So let us head out on our whirlwind tour of the United States. We're going to start in Salt Lake City with Ali Vallarta, the host of CityCast Salt Lake. Hello, Ali. How are you?
Hi, David.
So there will be no more federal land in Utah? Is that the plan?
Not exactly. So the state of Utah has filed a historic case asking the Supreme Court to basically make the federal government give 18.5 million acres of federal land over to the state to manage. So not all of it. But I do want to give a little context here, because not everyone in this room right now is in the West. So for context, I know we have Jacoby here from Chicago. Hey, Jacoby. 1% of Illinois is land owned and managed by the federal government. Here in Utah, 70% of our state is owned and managed by the federal government.
Damn.
So, right? So, like, our state officials love to go to bat with the feds about this. And of course, if you've ever visited Utah or Salt Lake City, chances are federal land is what brought you here. We've got the Mighty 5 national parks. It's beautiful. And I should clarify, David, the state doesn't want everything. They don't want the national parks. They're not fighting for national forests. They want land that is, quote unquote, unappropriated, which is kind of these like big swaths that are often near national parks. It's probably where you've camped for free if you've been here. And even though it's called unappropriated land, it does have a purpose still. Like there's grazing, there's mining. And this land is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which is in the West, the BLM. That's the Western BLM. So the size of land that Utah's fighting for right now is the size of South Carolina inside of Utah.
And how are they going to grab it? How do they feel that the state can, because presumably the federal government has rights to the land. So what's the case they're making?
I mean, the case they're making is, look, this land isn't national park. It hasn't been given any sort of like, you know, holy purpose like our national parks have. And they're asking the Supreme Court not necessarily to give this land to Utah, but to force the federal government to give up this land because basically it's not, you know, doing enough with it. is this case going to be taken up by the Supreme Court? And is this case going to be ruled in favor of Utah in the Supreme Court? I don't know. It seems unlikely. But we are living in unprecedented times. And if you've followed the Supreme Court recently, like, we're in a states' rights era, right? From abortion to undercutting the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. So Utah's been wanting to do this for a decade. Full disclosure, they even have a line item in our general fund that is for government overreach. Like, they have been putting aside money for this lawsuit, and they feel like, let's ride, boys. It's now or never. This is the kind of court that's going to give us this land and set the national precedent that, full disclosure, Project 2025 is interested in.
Are Utahns in favor of this? I mean, I assume there must be some popular support for this move, or they wouldn't be doing it.
Well, I think the state has kind of been saying the quiet part out loud for the past few years. And by that, I mean they've been passing or attempting to pass law after law that would either privatize or develop public land. So Utahns are suspicious, and I think rightfully so, right? Like, the cost alone for the state, like, if we think about the precedent here nationally, okay, there are 210 million acres of BLM land in the U.S. If this suit is ruled in Utah's favor, it could open up arguments from other states to take land. It could open up an argument to give up the national parks. Like, the precedent could be wild in this country. But the thing about it is, like, there is no guarantee that the federal government would give this land to Utah. They could give it to anyone. The court would just be ruling that they have to give it up, that they're not doing enough with it. And B, the cost to manage land is so expensive. It would cost, just in Utah, to manage this land, a couple $100 million. So wherever you are, listener, in the country, if your state had a couple $100 million bill, what kind of things would they do with land that is fertile with oil and gas and timber to pay that bill? I would follow your hunch there.
Texas is already licking its chops, I'm sure.
I would say Idaho is watching this carefully because 63% of our land is also federally owned. And there have been big movements to develop it and sell it. And so this is a hot button issue in Idaho.
Wow. Yeah. And there is also, I know, like in Nevada and here, you know, we've got Utah Senator Mike Lee, who brought a bill forward a couple years ago that was called, I think, the Homes Act or something. And he was basically saying, like, oh, we've got this housing crisis. We've got all this land. We could develop housing on this land. That is where I think, for me, this kind of becomes like a density issue. And I know that might feel like a stretch because we're talking about a rural place. But like, anyone who lives in a city is familiar with land hungriness, is familiar with this case that's always being made that we need more and more and more, fight for every inch. And what we know is that we tend to build stronger, safer, more tax revenue generating cities when we grow in and up. And so my brain, as the host of CityCast Salt Lake, is like become so density obsessed that I'm even viewing this lawsuit through that lens, David.
I want to stay in the West, actually. You just heard Lindsay Van Allen, the host of CityCast Boise, a second ago, also talking about matters of national import, but in this case around supermarkets. So from what I understand, Lindsay, Boise is the home of one of the great national supermarkets, and it's in the midst of a huge controversy.
Yeah, the Albertsons-Kroger merger hits really personally to people in Boise. Albertsons was actually founded in Boise in 1939 by Joe Albertson, and it employs over 6,000 people in the state and is one of the biggest employers in Boise. And it's not an exaggeration to say almost everyone in Boise knows someone who either works for Albertsons, works for corporate, their family, is really entrenched in Albertsons. And so this feels really personal, this idea of a merger. You'll hear people in Boise say, Joe wouldn't have wanted this for the community, or, Joe would never have done this. It feels very personal, this idea that Albertsons and Kroger are merging. and that this area could lose 10 to 13 of our grocery stores. What would that mean for people being unemployed? What would that mean for our grocery prices? Boise is definitely an area where wages have not kept up with inflation and grocery prices. And so people here are feeling the hurt when it comes to prices. And so the idea that our hometown grocery store is going to merge and raise prices significantly feels really, really personal to people here. But I know it's something that everyone nationwide has been watching.
I know about the merger a little bit, but would Kroger absorb Albertsons? Was Albertsons absorb Kroger? Would everything be now a Kroger?
Yeah. Kroger was going to buy out Albertsons in this first iteration of the merger. It was going to be a $25 billion deal. And so Albertsons would become Kroger, and the local Albertsons was going to offload about 10 to 13 stores locally.
And is it going to happen?
That is the question of the hour. The FTC has sued to stop that. That happened in the U.S. District Court in Portland, Oregon. The trial has wrapped up, but there has been no decision. Colorado has also sued to stop this merger, and that trial started September 30th. And then Washington State is waiting for their chance to sue to stop this merger. But something that's really interesting is Kroger has sued the FTC, citing the Chevron deference decision by the Supreme Court, saying that the FTC should not be able to use their in-house judges to stop this merger, that would be unconstitutional. So it really is up in the air. There is no clear answer at this point what would happen. But several groups have cited that this would raise grocery prices across the country. This would lead to potentially food deserts, places where there aren't grocery stores available. So the impact could be widespread across the whole country.
If anybody tried to come for H-E-B in Central Texas, let me tell you something. H-E-B is like our crowning glory. Like it's like we are very invested in Herbert Edward Butts and the entire H-E-B community, but they come in like there are superheroes. They come in during disasters. They feed people. Like we are very attached to our grocery store too, H-E-B.
Mm-hmm. Nikki, y'all love groceries the way that Pittsburgh loves to make fun of our grocery situation. We have one choice. It's headquartered here. That's all we got.
Which is what?
The giant eagle. The dirty bird.
What a name.
Of course.
In Illinois, these companies combined to run over 250 stores. And like for me, the grocery store growing up was Jewel's. It's technically Jewel Osco. There is no S, but for us, it's Jewel's. Mm-hmm. And in this deal, they announced that they would sell some, 500 stores to a different company to sort of get under the threshold so that their oligarchy can move forward. And that means nearly 35 stores in our area are likely to be sold under this deal. And while all of them promise that they don't have any plans to close any of the Jewel Osco, any of the Mariano's in our area, we are very suspect to grocery stores in the city of Chicago. We've seen Save-A-Lots close. We've seen Walmart's close. We've seen Mariano, Jewel's, Dominic's. I could go on and on about the lack of trust we have in the grocery cartel. And so for them to gain a bigger market share if this deal goes through means we're likely more vulnerable to their cost-cutting measures.
Not to be aggressively pro-Kroger here, but I will say right now, if you get your flu shot and your COVID vaccine at any Kroger, they will put $20 on your, they'll give you $20 in groceries.
Wait, I love that though.
Wait,
that's
what?
smart.
What?
I don't think that they should be price gouging and getting to do whatever they want because of that, but just like a low-key shout out.
I'll take it.
Everyone loves talking about grocery stores. We could probably just do this episode entirely about grocery stores, but we will not. But we are going to stay in the consumables world. We're going to go to Austin, where CityCast Austin host Nikki Devon is going to talk about this composting for all mandate, or not if it's a mandate, composting for all opportunity that Austin has now.
I mean, you're absolutely right. It is a mandate. Starting October 1st, the city of Austin was going to require all multifamily communities with 5 or more dwelling units to provide convenient access to commercial composting collection services to residents and employees. And so multifamily communities include apartment buildings, dorms, assisted living facilities, nursing homes, condos. And this is going to affect more than half of Austinites. So 85% of the city's landfill waste comes from people in apartments and commercial multifamily buildings. And 37% of that waste was compostable. And so Austin's like, enough of that. We're not having it. They're the first city in Texas to require composting access for multifamily communities. And I think that that's mainly because of our very ambitious zero waste initiative that is aiming to reduce 90% of our waste from landfills and incinerators by 2040. So landlords got to provide compost containers, collection services. They have to educate their residents and employees about the compost with signs in 2 languages. And you know, it's required to update every single year. And they offer rebates and waivers to help offset the costs. But y'all, here's what's hilarious and very Austin. A local news outlet did a story where they called around and asked a bunch of landlords and property managers, like, hey, you guys, how are you preparing? And like 2 said, oh, yeah, we're doing some stuff to get ready. And then the majority of the people they called were like, what? What's happening? Like they had no idea that this is coming up. And so they asked the Austin Resource Recovery handles all of our waste. And their director says, well, okay, in February, we're going to nudge anyone out of compliance. We're going to send them a little nudge. And they're still out of compliance by next October. They could face a Class C misdemeanor, but the city is not going to be issuing any fines. So it's just going to be like, you're in timeout. We want you to compost, which is very Austin. It's very Austin.
I know in Texas you have this problem where you blue dot cities, you have a red state government that is like, we don't want you to do this. I would have thought composting would be one of these things where the Republican state legislator would be like, this is terrible. Why are we wasting time on composting? Are they going after it at all?
No, because we have this zero waste initiative and it is very ambitious and we really think we're going to do it. But at the end of the day, our recycling is abysmal. Like Austin is a city of triers. We going to try it. Like everywhere in the city practically will offer a 3-bin trash, like trash, recycle, or compost. They offer it. But the issue is that a lot of us just don't know what we can and can't recycle or compost. We don't know. So, you know, we try, but I don't think Texas is worried about it, to be quite honest. I think they're just like, okay, well, we're going to let those hippies do whatever they do with their trash as long as they're not paying attention to their rights. We don't care about the trash.
I wonder if everyone will come to be disillusioned with composting the way they're disillusioned with recycling. The recycling became so confusing and so hard to follow in most cities that people just are very down on it. I wonder if that'll happen with composting.
It still is. I mean, it still is. We have our recycling picks up mixed paper, hard plastic, metal, and glass. That is it. Anything else you want to recycle, you can take yourself to our recycling and reuse center. And I think the reality of that is that the only people that do that are people like my partner. Like, I just don't think everybody is going to go out of their way to be like, no, don't throw that coffee top away. No, babe, we can recycle that. Like everybody's going to do that.
Okay, for all the things about Idaho, all day I could be like, here's how Idaho doesn't do great. Boise has a great composting program and It's been super successful. So if y'all want, like, I wouldn't suggest that we could help with a lot of things, but one thing the city of Boise has done very well is composting. I mean, we had TikTok dances. It's very popular.
What?
It's a whole it's a whole thing. It's very popular. Big program with the city. So I don't know if Austin would I'd love to help you because when it's successful, it's very great. It's fantastic.
You want to hear something? I live in a smart housing apartment complex that is sponsored by the city. No composting. Our recycling is a nightmare. My partner takes my composting, puts it in her freezer, keeps it in her freezer, and then her friend that has a house allows her to then put her compost in her house bin. And the reality is that everybody ain't got that kind of time. Like everybody's not trying to be that much of a good person. I'm surely not. If she didn't do it, there would be no compost in this house. So here we are.
We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of our Mayor Brandon Johnson's citywide composting program, because less than 9% of the trash in Chicago stays out of the landfill. We have a notorious landfill on our southeast side that you can smell for miles and miles as you approach it. But I am not sure how well it is doing the city. We did an entire episode on composting. We got a composting sponsor, and I ain't composted a damn thing. So I need to start where I sit.
Get with it, Jacoby. Come on, man. Come on.
Listen.
I ain't been on it. And I got a lot of banana peels, and they just going in the trash can.
All right, we're going to stay in Chicago. That was CityCast Chicago host Jacoby Cochran. Jacoby, you are doing composting poorly, excuse me. It sounds like maybe you're also shot spotting poorly. You wanted to talk about the controversy in your city over the company formerly known as ShotSpotter. Tell us about ShotSpotter and why Chicago is up in arms about it.
Yeah, Chicago is not dumping its waste well, but is currently dumping its gunshot detection technology. Back in September, Brandon Johnson announced that he is going to move forward with his campaign promise, and he decommissioned SoundThinking, the company that was recently known as ShotSpotter. Let me back up a little bit. Over the last 6 years, Chicago has paid over $60 million to ShotSpotter. They have over 2,000 sensors in our city, largely located in Black and brown neighborhoods, largely disinvested neighborhoods, and thus where you do see high concentrations of gun violence. And over these 6 years, the responses have been a mixed bag depending on who you ask. Earlier this year in February, Mayor Brandon Johnson was like, all right, I campaigned hard on getting rid of this technology. I attended some of his rallies, and it was a major talking point about his administration. He promised that he would get rid of it because we had growing sources from our Office of Inspector General, from the MacArthur Center of Justice, that said not only is ShotSpotter not living up to its mission to prevent or lower gun violence, it was very rarely leading to arrests, evidence being recovered, guns being recovered, and ultimately it was leading police to prioritize those alerts rather than the 911 calls that were coming in. Also, the sensors, people had a lot of questions like, okay, how much is it actually picking up gunshots? How many gunshots is it missing? How many times is it misinterpreting the sound of an 18-wheeler driving through the back of the yards neighborhood, a neighborhood that has a large manufacturing footprint. And again, those numbers were constantly showing that its efficacy and the data that the company was putting out couldn't necessarily be trusted. And it wasn't just in the city of Chicago. In fact, the New York City Comptroller's Office released a very similar study earlier this year that challenges its use. Now, you would think that'd be the end of it. The mayor, who has the power to sign and end contracts, says he doesn't want this anymore. However, our city council immediately pushed back when one of our alder people introduced legislation that would require a city council vote to cancel the contract. The mayor was like, you ain't got no power to do that. I don't care. They passed the ordinance 34-14 back in May. The mayor dismissed it. A couple of weeks ago, the council, led by the same alderperson, took another vote where they said, okay, we would like the contract negotiation power to be given over to the superintendent of police, Larry Snelling. The city council agreed again. They voted 33-14. And the mayor, once again, didn't agree with this decision, said they don't have the legal authority. He was going to veto it, chose not to, and sensors started being decommissioned at the end of September.
Are there other cities where SoundThinking / ShotSpotter is operating?
Yes, cities that have either picked up interest or started work with the technology or expanded over the last few years includes places like New York City, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Seattle, Syracuse. However, over the past decade, places like Atlanta, New Orleans, San Antonio, Charlotte, and now Chicago have ended their use, with very similar bodies within their cities professing the same thing, which is, hey, we don't believe that ShotSpotter is lowering gun violence. We don't believe that it leads to arrests or evidence being recovered. And we ultimately think it's sending police charged into already over-policed, disinvested environments. And so, yeah, now we're kind of at this stalemate.
Pittsburgh is one of them. And our city council has actually doubled down. So we've spent a fraction of what Chicago has, though we are, of course, a fraction of the size. We have had it since 2015, and they just put it into new neighborhoods earlier this year. So our contract is like $1.2 million per year. You can do the math on how long it's been around. And I think the last data I saw, it was a couple of years old. Right now, it's covering roughly 18 miles of our city's 55 square miles. Like, that's a really huge chunk of the city of Pittsburgh. And it is exactly where you think it would be. It's being installed in our predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods and in low-income areas. And the still relatively new chief of police, he loves it. Like, he's all in.
What's a shot spotter?
I got you. It's ultimately a radar or sensor that's maybe put up on a light pole, and it's supposed to listen and accurately hear gunshots and send alerts to police officers, with their argument being that over 80% of gunshots are not ever reported or called in. And to that, I will be honest. I mean, I grew up and gunshots, the sound of motorcycles, a car backing up, these were just like sounds of the city that necessarily
Or you play
didn't
that
happen.
game of like, is it fireworks or is it gunshots? And it's like, it's fine.
And I'm not saying that happened all day, every day, but it's just something you accepted. And, you know, as a public safety strategy, you would like to know, all right, are those gunshots leading to people being hurt? Is this leading to people being killed? Right? Are these mass casualty events? So this is important. And the idea of the technology, which is why so many city council members fight for it so hard, is because it sounds like it's a great crime fighting tool. It sounds exactly what a city that is dealing with a disproportionate amount of gun violence would want. And you know, we gave it a shot. Unfortunately, the data says that maybe it's not living up to that reality. And while I think we should be questioning the use of technology in surveillance and public safety, our mayor has already put out a request for other companies to pitch themselves to the city. And so we're getting one company, but maybe not this conversation.
We have too much celebratory gunfire for that to work.
In Texas, it'd just be one long shot spotter.
This feels very meanwhile in Utah. But we're about to get ammunition vending machines, which is like,
what?
And now for zero effort.
I'm sure we're right behind you, Utah. We're coming up.
I think you've actually already got them.
We might already have them, yeah. We might already
Yeah.
have them in Texas, for sure.
All right, let's move to my hometown here in Washington, D.C. We have CityCast DC's Julia Caron talking about one of the crises of the city. Every city, of course, these days has a housing crisis of some sort, multiple housing crises. And D.C. is suffering from one that I was really surprised to learn about, Julia.
So DC, for people who don't know, is actually very tenant friendly, like big time tenant rights. We talked to the Office of Tenant Rights actually about what people can do if their landlords are being dumb and don't replace things. But y'all might remember the pandemic back in 2020, that housing was a big issue then. And people were worried about getting evicted from their houses, from their apartments, and they'd have to leave. In DC, what they did was they expanded the emergency rental assistance program to basically say, hey, you know, we understand that you're undergoing hard times right now, but we're going to figure this out together. It's okay if you have back pay on your rental payments. Fast forward to today, and now DC is at essentially a huge housing crisis because a bunch of people haven't paid their rent. And DC, who is known to be pro-tenant, is now swinging completely in the opposite direction. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson announced emergency legislation, rolling back what was originally part of the emergency rental assistance program stuff, saying, hey, like, you guys need to pay your rent because landlords now have to pay their mortgages. Those bills are coming due. And it might kick a lot of people out of their homes. 97,000 people rely on emergency rental assistance. And so this could get very messy very, very quickly.
Yeah. So like 1 in every 7 Washingtonians is relying on emergency rental assistance. And because they suspended evictions and, you know, made it much harder for landlords to kick out people who were unable to pay or weren't paying, you know, people were able to stay in their housing. And now, so it's one of these things where landlords, I mean, I think everyone has ambivalence about landlords, but these are folks who have properties that they are not collecting enough rent on them to maintain the properties or to be able to support themselves. So they have these tenants who are way overdue in their rent. They themselves don't have the money to support their property. And the city no longer has these extra COVID funds to sort of backstop everybody. And that seems like a recipe for a lot of people suffering.
Yeah. I mean, there's also like some landlords have reported that some people have upwards of $40,000 in back payment on rent. Like that is one person's annual salary potentially in back payment on rent. And so like, I don't know where people are going to come up with this money to pay back these landlords. And apparently like a lot of industry analysts are saying that like 20,000 affordable housing units in DC are at risk of foreclosure because of this. Mayor Bowser's like, we don't want to see people become homeless. We don't want to see people get kicked out on the street. But she's asking people like, hey, please pay your rent because the bills are due right now.
And actually, just to add one twist, which I learned from CityCast DC, is that so if a landlord is unable to make their payments, if their tenants are not paying the rent, they stop being able to make their payments, and their property goes into foreclosure and the bank takes the property, all the rent protections that apply to that property stop existing. So the bank can then sell that property to a developer who will develop it at market rate housing, and it will just be more, fancy apartments. And so it's one of these situations where the landlords who are maintaining sort of housing that serves lots of people with lower incomes are getting foreclosed on, and this housing is then disappearing, and DC is becoming even more a playground for rich people, which it already is.
Yeah, it's how many fancy condos with like fancy marble countertops can you build for DC's population? I don't know. Is anything like this happening in your guys' cities as well?
In Austin, our housing is just out of control. The city has a smart housing program that gives all of these rebates and incentives for new builds and even, current builds that will offer rate at a discounted amount. But our housing has gotten so bad now that it's any developer that comes in that wants to build, the city is like, you got to give us something. You got to give us 8%, 8 units, some sort of MFI. We have to, because now we've reached like critical point where we're losing people. People can't afford to live here anymore. Families are losing their housing. And so the city is just now finally playing hardball with new developers. But we haven't really seen anybody being evicted and like developers taking over or being, that sounds rough. That's hard.
Yeah.
That's harsh.
It's definitely not ideal. It's not good. Exactly.
I say that the situation in Boise is very different in that we don't have great renter protections.
That's what I was going to say about Chicago.
Yeah, so the issue is there aren't great renter protections. Companies are coming in, building, of course, very expensive housing. They don't have to have low-cost units or affordable units. And then companies are buying apartment complexes and jacking up the rent 50%, 100%, 200%. We had evictions in our city double last year, and we just don't have the resources to manage it. But we're so desperate for housing that, our city's like, yes, if you can build, please build. But it's a lot of stuff that people who live here can't afford.
Our last stop on our tour is outside of Pittsburgh. Megan Harris, the host of CityCast Pittsburgh. My goodness, when you told me that 3 Mile Island, the nuclear power plant, was back, I just flashed back to 1979. Man, as a kid, that was the story that I was gripped by. You all are too young for this. The story I was utterly gripped by as a 9-year-old was what is going to happen at 3 Mile Island. And now this is a nuclear power plant that's back providing low carbon, low CO2, no CO2 emission power to Microsoft, I guess.
Well, it will be.
not to the public.
Yeah. If everything goes to plan and all of the regulatory agencies that have to weigh in say yes, then by 2028, it will be back online. But we'll start with a little TMI, 3 Mile Island history. So if you are not familiar with what happened, it is in central PA, very close to our state capital, but not far drive from Pittsburgh. Construction began in 68. It actually opened fully operational in 78. And then in 79, in March of 79, the younger of the 2 reactors suffered a partial meltdown. So something went wrong with a valve, toxic air was released, and it was not initially clear how bad it was. Turns out good news, not very. No one died. There were no cancers that were ever linked to what happened. But for the people who lived there, and probably people all over the country, all over the world, it was super scary. So here in Pennsylvania, there were lockdowns and evacuations. I mean, for years after, it sparked waves of nuclear activism. And then, of course, after the evacuations, everyone here got to come home. But I mean, to speak to your point, David, I think for a lot of people, it still looms very large. And maybe most notoriously, it is still considered the worst nuclear accident in U.S. history.
Wow.
But they're not reopening it to provide energy to
for the
schools.
masses? No. For
it's
one
for
client.
AI.
Yeah, it's for Microsoft. So this is an unprecedented deal.
Whoa.
We've all heard about the data centers and how much energy that they suck out of everything. We love our memes and our cat videos and all the jokes, but like it really does take a tremendous amount of energy to power all of that. And all of these tech companies can't turn to their home bases for this. It's often cooled by water. They need something consistent, something that runs 24/7, and nuclear can. So unlike solar and hydro and wind energy or natural gas, which has to be pumped from one place to another, nuclear can actually do this. And there are only 2 plants in the country that have been closed, but are not so closed that they can't be brought back online. And one of them is 3 Mile Island, which is also the place where this huge accident happened. So in our case, it closed in 2019. The one that didn't melt down, it just kept plugging along. And the only reason it actually got shut down is just because it wasn't turning a profit anymore by comparison to all those other things. But now we have a climate crisis and data centers. So the energy landscape here in Pennsylvania and all over the country has changed a lot. And I think that's the salient point for all of us in every city on this is that, particularly for places not associated with big tech, if there's a data center in your power grid and your region has an untapped energy source, for example, it is an AI arms race, baby. And something unconventional like this could be coming for your area next.
I mean, if you want an example of what could happen, like Northern Virginia, a suburb of DC, fun fact, enables about 70% of the world's online activity because of the data centers that are located out there.
Oh,
and
yeah.
a bunch
There's
of
those
residents.
2 in Richmond, Virginia, plus there's a third out in Chicago. And I suspect that that's going to be 3 Mile Island servicing them. So our power grid, to zoom out a little bit, that Pennsylvania is plugged into, it's PJM that services Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, Jersey, parts of Kentucky, and West Virginia. That's what 3 Mile Island is going to be pumping its power into. And that is what the Microsoft data centers there in Richmond and Chicago are all plugged into too. So 3 Mile Island creates energy, it goes into the grid, and then these data centers are what's pumping it out. The idea is that it's going to be 1-to-1. So whatever Microsoft draws out is what 3 Mile Island is going to be pumping in. So what you do there in DC is going to be powered by Central Pennsylvania.
Yeah. And basically now a bunch of Nova residents are miffed because they're looking at all of the environmental costs. So things like stormwater runoff, like, from buildings and parking lots, like there's air pollution from the backup generators. And there's also a bunch of pressure that it puts on the local power grid. So Dominion Energy is having to figure out how to handle all of this. Because again, if 70% of the world's web traffic goes through Northern Virginia, like the energy has to go somewhere.
Yeah, our governor signed a bill that essentially ends the decades-long moratorium that our state has had on new nuclear power construction. And I mean, after all regulations, there is a likely that come the 2030s that we'll see some type of nuclear plant emerge in our state. And so I just wonder, of the, was it close to 100 that are up and operated, are any primarily used for a private company?
Not a single one. This will be the first time
Wow.
that it's one single client buying 100% of the energy, and their contract, if it goes through, is going to serve them for 20 years.
That's
But Jacoby,
terrifying.
as you're looking at some of those plans, like it takes a long time to build a nuclear plant, like 10 plus years. And even the little reactors now that they're creating, that's still a long time to get approved, to get built. And if they want tax incentives, for example, which they're going for federally and at the state level for 3 Mile Island, you have to prove that it's worth it first. So like at the federal level, you have to say it's a new energy source. Is 3 Mile Island new? Can we call it new? And then for the state level, you have to have the jobs first. So it means it has to be up and running, and you have to prove that it is now a job provider before it qualifies for a state incentive.
And Austin, there are whispers in, dark rooms about turning our current power plants in the city, how we can transfer those into nuclear, more green, renewable energy plants when they're essentially just like old power plants that are a little too close to neighborhoods. One was shut down in like 1978. It's in a historically Black neighborhood. And now they're like, I don't know, maybe we could use that for renewable green energy. So it's spreading.
And all over the country, our energy bills are going to go up because of this. Bloomberg says that by 2030, AI is going to be using 17% of all U.S. electricity. Right now, it's like 5%. So you need new energy sources like this coming online and hopefully smart ways to do it. But we have to figure out something, because if the computing power keeps taking up what it's taken up, it's going to be ratepayers. It's going to be every single one of us in the U.S. paying for this in some way or another.
That was so wonderful listening to you all talk about issues that your hometowns are facing. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on CityCast USA and hearing about things that may be talked about in your city in months to come. If you have friends or family living in another CityCast city, please tell them about the great podcast in their hometown. We'll be back tomorrow with a regular episode of your local CityCast. Till then, goodbye all.
Bye, David.
Bye, David.